Welcome to the Maine Climate Council's special emergency meeting called by Governor Mills on the topic of how to make Maine more resilient to the impacts of climate change. We are meeting at an important time. Today you'll hear from community leaders, scientists, state leaders, and others in detail about what our state has experienced over the last month and year, what worked and what didn't. And more importantly, as charged by the governor, we'll start the conversation about the path forward to accelerate our work to build greater resilience across all of our communities and embedded in the work of the Climate Council. This work is both urgent and it is long-term, and it requires all of us working together. My name is Hannah Pingree. I'm the director of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, and the co-chair of the Maine Climate Council. And on behalf of my co-chair, who we may be on the panel, Commissioner Melanie Loisem, I'm pleased to welcome Governor Mills, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, staff from our entire congressional delegation, Maine Climate Council members of the Community Resilience and Coastal and Marine Working Groups, legislators, the media, and others. Also a thank you to the University of Maine Augusta and President Cushman for having us here today. And also a big thank you to leaders from Vermont who have driven over the mountains in between us to be with us here today and to share guidance on how Vermont, who has been facing extreme flooding events for 10 plus years, on how they're building back more resilience in their communities. We are also joined by hundreds of Maine citizens who are watching this meeting online. And we thank you for your interest, and we urge you to stay engaged in the Maine Climate Council's process in the year ahead. So a brief reminder, the Maine Climate Council is charged in statute with producing strategies to support Maine's Climate Council goals that are in law, including reducing our emissions 45% by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050, achieving carbon neutrality by 2045, and developing strategies to protect Maine's communities, economy, and people from the impacts of climate change. The strategies required to adapt, build greater resilience, and to accelerate our work protecting Maine's communities, economy, and people are the reason why we are here today. The Climate Council delivered our first climate plan on December 1, 2020, Maine Won't Wait. And now, 3 years into this plan, the members of the council are charged with the help and support of 6 working groups and 2 subcommittees with the heavy lifting of updating our plan, as required by law, by December 1, 2024. And with that, I will turn it over to my boss, Governor Janet Mills, who coined the term Maine Won't Wait before the United Nations in September of 2019. I thank her for her leadership on these issues, and I welcome her to the podium.
Thank you, and thank you for being here for this special meeting. You know, we're talking about resilience, and what does that really mean? I think it's had many meanings down through the decades and centuries of our state and national existence. And to me today, resilience means a couple of things. And it's good to see half my cabinet here. Thank you very much. I know you're working. Resilience today, and we're talking about these storms that have really created the need for these meetings, these discussions that are so important. Resilience means not just preparing and repairing and rebuilding physical infrastructure. Resilience is also something that refers to the character of a people, the character of a state. And I'd like you to think about that while we're having this discussion today, looking at what Vermont has done, looking at what Maine has already done, looking at what we can do tomorrow and the next year and the next few decades. It's easy to think, well, maybe this one storm, that was just an aberration, you know, a one-off. Or maybe the 3 storms we've had in the last month are just an aberration or 3 off. But I think we all know better. And we've got to think about the future, not simply about repairing and rebuilding from the damage of the 3 storms we suffered through the last month or so, the last 5 weeks. But what do we do about the future? We've always been talking about that. We've been doing some things with Hannah's leadership. We've engaged more than 170 towns, communities in thinking about this. We're not talking just about riprap and wharfs. We're talking about being ready in many, many ways. So thank you for being part of this discussion. 5 years ago, with eyes wide open and open to the irrefutable evidence of the impacts of climate change and how it was harming our state. We talked about ticks coming to Maine from warmer climes. We talked about the rising seas and the effect on lobster fishing, et cetera. We talked about all kinds of aspects of climate change. And that is why we convened this wonderful group, this council of citizens and scientists and business leaders and bipartisan state and local officials, and convened them in order to take action, give us a plan to combat the threat of climate change. And based on your recommendations in our state's 4-year climate action plan, oops, I have it here, Maine Won't Wait. I know you've all not only read it, you wrote most of it. Based on those recommendations, we have been working hard to reduce harmful greenhouse gas emissions and investing significant resources to make our communities more resilient in every way to the impacts of climate change. Thanks to our joint efforts, Maine now has the fastest growing clean energy economy of any New England state. Take that, Vermont. And, oh yeah, okay. When they're here, you tell them I said that. And thanks to our efforts jointly, 175 communities across Maine are preparing for extreme weather and improving infrastructure and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's easy to think about repairing after the fact, but boy, oh boy, prevention is worth more than after the fact repairs. I'm proud of the progress we've made, but I'm here today because your work has become so much more urgent than ever before. As you all know, this past December, a powerful rain and windstorm brought severe flooding, power outages, and such extensive damage to central and western Maine. Pete Rogers over there was out traveling around trying to take note of the depth of the water and the number of bridges that were out, and Bruce Van Note getting out there trying to figure out how much is this one going to cost, how much was that one going to cost. But we've got a good team on this thing. And then earlier this month, two other very powerful storms that hit a different part of Maine for the most part, and that brought rain, wind, and flooding that once again ravaged our state, damaging coastal communities and working waterfronts up and down the coast, and altering the very landscape of our iconic coast. These storms, we know, were made more violent by the egregious effects of climate change. The ocean is warming, the sea is rising, the winds are wilder, and perhaps even more importantly, we all know that more storms like these will follow. We have got to act now. Soon I'll be proposing a supplemental budget. And as I think about making new investments to make our communities more resilient to combat climate change, it is important that I hear from all of you as I hear from others across the state. What do you believe is necessary to preserve our working waterfronts and our downtowns? What is necessary to protect people and property from extreme weather events? To safeguard our health, including our access to clean air and clean water? What's necessary to make our economy, which is based so heavily on our natural resources, more resilient? In the wake of these recent storms and in anticipation of those to come, we have to have a serious conversation as a state about what we can all do to prepare for the impact of these weather events and climate change in general. I look forward to hearing from you and from the members of this distinguished Maine Climate Council and from representatives of our congressional delegation and from the state of Vermont. Vermont, as you all know, has experienced several extreme weather events in recent years, and last year especially. And I'm grateful that they're joining us here today to share their insights. We started this work 5 years ago. Thankfully, we got a head start compared to many states. But these recent storms have underscored the urgency of our efforts to combat climate change in every way. And so on behalf of the people of Maine, I want to thank you for being here and for your ongoing work to brainstorm and plan and to protect this precious place, the state of Maine, which we all call home. I will turn things back over to Hannah and Melanie in a minute, but I want to also introduce our distinguished member of Congress from the 1st Congressional District, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Governor Mills. Thank you for including me and for your great remarks. Thank you for the work you chose to do when you first got elected to office, that you've continued to do, and truly putting our state ahead of so many others in terms of planning, thinking ahead, acknowledging the challenges, and as you said today, having the best energy-dependent, related, renewable economy, whatever the term was. That's cool. That's great. Thank you, Hannah, for the work that you and Melanie have done on the Climate Council, and all of you who have participated. It's really impressive to be able to show many of my colleagues the work that's happened here in Maine, all the work that so many people have done and brought together. And Hannah, mostly just thanks for letting your mother come to a meeting. Very proud, very proud. I'm really thrilled that I'm on recess from Washington this week. That's always a good week for me. But it's great. That means that me and I know the staff from all of my colleagues are able to participate today. For me, it meant I got to pay a long visit to my hometown and see some of the storm-related damages. Many of you saw J.L. Brown's boatyard, which is indicative of what was happening up and down the coast. But you talk about resilience, about communities pulling together. Between the first storm and the second storm, to see my own community turn out and do everything they could, whether it's trying to tie down a building, weight down a building, think through what the next storm is going to do, how it's going to attack, and how to be prepared to withstand the damage. All we can say is at least the building is still standing, and that's what's really mattered to all of us. But that wasn't, of course, the only damage. That wasn't the only damage in my town. We were able this morning to take a tour of some of the communities, look at fish piers, municipal wharfs, see some of the damage. Even though much of it is starting to be cleaned up, the underpinnings are still destroyed. And whether it's a fishing pier, a wharf that's gone, a marina, a boatyard, it's insurmountable, really, the work that has to be done to clean up the damage, but also to make us resilient going into the future. And I'm particularly pleased that I get to be here with all of you. Thank you, everybody who's put so much work into the Climate Council, to the panel and others, and the cabinet members and everyone who's working on this. But for me, and I know for the rest of the delegation, this is a great opportunity to really hear from a broad cross-section of people about what we need to do, what it's going to cost in the future, what are the techniques that we're going to use. This is bigger than any of us. This is, no longer, we're not talking about the 100-year flood or the 300-year flood. This is a 3 times a month storm, and let's hope it doesn't happen again 3 times next month, but it's certainly not something we can wait for another 100 years to see what happens. I know all of us on the delegation are really dedicated to making sure that we find every federal dollar that we can squeeze out that belongs here in Maine, whether it's FEMA money, SBA money, everything we can possibly get from a disaster declaration, something to help our fisheries and the access to our fisheries. Both myself and Senator Collins have bills on working waterfront, and they've never been more timely than they are today, because we're going to lose some of our working waterfronts because of this storm. Some of it we won't be able to rebuild. We won't be able to see back again, and we couldn't afford to lose a foot of it before the storm, and now we're going to be worried about how to strengthen it so we don't lose any more. We're going to look at legislation or appropriations or anything we can possibly do, because, as I said, this isn't the only time we're going to see this storm, and how we think ahead to create that kind of resilience and strengthen our coastal communities, how do we think into the future? I know that's why you're all here, and I'm really looking forward to that kind of information and brainstorming that's going to happen with all of you. This is our opportunity to learn from each other. This is our opportunity to go back and talk to Congress about how do communities deal with these things, whether it's Vermont and their floods, Maine and our inland floods, or these coastal storm surges that are unpredictable, bigger than we ever could possibly imagine, and likely to be bigger again in the future with more power than we ever thought was possible. So it's kind of scary thinking out into the future. It's scary for all of our communities, but we're never going to be able to think ahead if we can't find these ways to work together. So again, I'm just really grateful to be here. Thank you for all of you for taking so much time, and I look forward to learning a lot today, and a good day out of Washington.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Congresswoman Pingree. I only let my mother come to events once in a while, but we have an amazing panel here of community and state leaders. I'm going to introduce them, and they're going to go down the line and talk about the impacts they've seen over the last month and sort of what is unique about what we've seen. So I'm going to introduce them all at once. So Kathleen Billings, to my left, Town Manager of Stonington, also on the Coastal and Marine Working Group. Gary Lamb, City Manager of City of Hallowell, also Maine Climate Council member. Jesse Perkins, Director of the Bethel Area Chamber of Commerce, a Maine Climate Council member. Commissioner Melanie Loisem, the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection and my co-chair, as you all know. Joyce Taylor, the Chief Engineer of the Maine Department of Transportation, also the co-chair of the Transportation Working Group. Meredith Mendelson, the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Marine Resources. Commissioner Heather Johnson, Department of Economic and Community Development, also member of the Maine Climate Council. Dr. Terry Vaugh, the Director of the Maine CDC, Maine Climate Council member. Director Dan Burgess of the Governor's Energy Office, a member of the Maine Climate Council and the co-chair of the Energy Working Group. And last but not least, Pete Rogers, the Director of Maine Emergency Management Agency, who has been working day and night, and we are grateful to have him here. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Kathleen, and we're just going to go right down the line. Folks talking about what they've experienced in each of their communities and areas they work in the last month and beyond. So thank you, Kathleen. Is it on? Give it a test. There, you got it.
Hi, all. Thank you for coming and your interest in it. Stonington, Stonington is a town, we have about 350 lobster fishing boats, other vessels that go for other species as well also too. And January 10th was, just a horrible storm and experience for us. And we have a few pictures to share with this. The picture there is our commercial fish pier. It's a solid infill granite pier. She did overtop, but she didn't move, compared to the other ones. The other thing is, too, when we had that surge that came in, it was like a 3 or 4 foot surge. I was actually watching on my security cameras when it happened. This photo here we're sharing is the Idaho Boat Company dock. With the surge, it picked it right up and took it off the pins. There's parts of their dock they cannot use. This is Co-op 1. They received significant damage, and also, too, they were, one of the docks had done some resiliency work and trying to improve and strengthen it up. Well, that storm surge, it buckled it. You can't even drive a forklift on it. And, safety-wise, it's compromised, and they've had to move down to Co-op 1 temporarily until they figure out how they can fix or afford to do this one. This is Oceanville Road, and part of our GEI engineering plan, we were going to raise up Causeway because with the sea level rise that has been coming, we knew we were going to have to raise that road. We'd already done Moose Island Causeway. But the issue with that one is with that storm, and subsequently Saturday's storm was the same thing. There is so much water that runs there now. It's like almost 4 feet high, and had to go back with my engineer because now what we thought that we had planned for that sea level rise and the storms is not going to be adequate now. This is the thing that we're facing. Anything that we're doing, whether it's us or the state, it's not enough. It's starting to overtake us. This is Hagen Dock. We rebuilt that. Our fire station got flooded and compromised. Maine Coastal Fisheries building, the water was right up underneath them, and along with a lot of our waterfront, and received. This is the Causeway, Deer Owl Causeway. The DOT had blocked that off. We're having issues with the sea level rise. The bridge is the same thing with the severe storms. It's, I'd have to say, my biggest thing is now challenge that we're facing is I have a whole bunch of work in waterfront down there now, along with my own municipal roads and stuff. They don't even know where to begin. The permitting is a process, the mitigation is a process. They're worried about trying to build back with piers. It's either going to be compromised or ripped up again. They're talking about solid infill. It takes time to get permits, but the only thing is with 350 lobster boats, I mean, they need to get going in 2 months. There is no other place to put these boats, and how we get ahead of that is going to be imperative. The other thing is, too, is I desperately want to work with the DOT and other agencies because, you know, the sea level rise and the climate change is overtaking everything that we have. I can fix local roads, but the state needs resources for the state roads, too. It's just not going to go away, and it's coming on us faster than what we anticipated. So, you know, I'm hoping to see, you know, some help with that, DEP, Army Corps, to figure out some strategies how to get these guys going and the permits and everything they need, which they need for borrowing purposes or whatever. So thankful for the help. Go for it, Gary.
Thank you, Kathleen.
My heart goes out to the people on the coast. We got hit pretty good, as did other places, but people on the coast got it a lot worse. I want to talk a little bit about data. National Weather Service and USGS data projects the level of the Kennebec River, which was key to how we responded before the flood levels got to the height of your picture there. So Sunday, December 17th, we knew we were all going to get wet. We knew it was going to rain. Monday, we get up and we come in, and we know we need to start moving cars off Front Street, right next to the river. We got our barricades up, Public Works and Police, and did their usual thing. People down there that live there, the 2- and 3-story apartments there, they know they need to move when the weather's coming. So they did that. All the cars were out of the way by dark on Monday. We went to bed expecting it was going to be about like the May 1st storm. We got up, and Tuesday morning, I checked the projections, and this data is worth its weight in gold. We have a flood gauge in Hollowell right by the bulkhead. And that told me that there were 5 more feet of water coming about midnight that night. So we really ratcheted up into another phase with Public Works and Police going down and talking to people. Floods of trucks came in, the biggest U-Hauls you could get. Frozen food, fresh food, furniture, merchandise went up to the 2nd floor or went out into somebody's pickup truck out of the way of the downtown. All kinds of things happened with dozens, if not hundreds of people helping. We had all day Tuesday and into early Tuesday night to move all those things. The river peaked around midnight on Wednesday morning, early Wednesday morning, as we knew it would. The predictions were right on spot. And Water Street was closed off for about 24 hours. There's just too much water to drive a vehicle through unless you're going very slow with a high clearance engine. Many businesses were flooded out at the sidewalk level. Most are open. We hope the tap room opens by February 1st, but some are going to take much longer. And all the businesses or the storage areas in the basement were, anything down there was destroyed. The water was right up to the ceiling joist, so anything electrical with motors is gone. On the recovery side, we're thankful there was no loss of life. No buildings went downstream. No cars floated away, which is a good thing. The interesting and frustrating thing was on Thursday, after the storm and the waters went down, we discovered that we needed a CMP electrical inspection for every building before they would energize that part of the city. We hadn't had to do that on May 1st. The water wasn't that high. And I don't think they had this form in 1987 when the water was 6 feet taller. But we scrambled. Thursday afternoon, we plastered the downtown, knocking on doors and putting out pieces of paper, inspection forms. We had a property manager that helped us a great deal. And by Friday, we had all the forms to CMP. They hooked the city up, that part of the city up on Saturday with power again. The other thing that Hollowell needs to do is increase our emergency communication capabilities. We don't have a dispatch center. We use Augusta. So either reverse 911, code red, Nixle, or whatever other software application we pick, we need to get going on that. Because remember, if it's an ice jam, you don't have 12 to 14 hours to respond. You might have an hour, and then the water can be up, 8 or 10 feet, and you've got a real problem. So my heart goes out to people on the coast. We had it pretty bad, and so did this young lady next to me here. But it's all different, and I thank you for the invitation for being here.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Governor Mills, for calling this meeting. It's clear that we've all just faced some wake-up calls, and it's I'm really glad that this didn't just get kind of swept behind us. We all, as Mainers, we like to say, oh, we're Mainers, we're tough, we'll keep going. But this one really was different. So I'm showing a map here because, of course, we have the Androscoggin River in our area, but I wanted to just demonstrate how many other rivers flow directly into this. The Androscoggin River, this is only about a, let's say, 20, 30-mile radius that you're looking at. And this is just off the top of my head. It is a deranged river, which means it flows north, south, east, and west over the course of its flow, which is a term that I love. It's a deranged river, so you all learned something today. Hey. So anyway, rivers are in our mountainous corner of the state, basically the rivers are the only way to go from town to town. They're what carves the tunnels through the mountains, and the roads have to go through next to the river. So all of our roads are next to rivers, basically. So from west to east, the Wild River is an Evans Notch along Route 113. It's the main road through Maine's only national forest. It's also closed in the winter anyway, but many areas were completely undermined, washed out, covered in landslides. This is usually a snowmobile trail in the wintertime. Not this year. The Pleasant River overtopped Route 2. Can you go back a slide a little bit? Pleasant River overtopped Route 2 in this area, and the line of traffic spent the night there in their vehicles. On Millbrook, turned Gould Academy Fields into a lake. It completely covered Route 2 there. 2 tractor-trailer trucks and 2 other vehicles became disabled here trying to cross. I met 2 of the guys who were in one of those vans under the overpass and sent them to my office. Maybe they spent the night there, I'm not sure. Alder River formed a lake from Bethel Village almost all the way to the backside of Mount Abram, which is like 4 or 5 miles away. Twitchell Brook, which no one ever heard of before, except for it's like the condos next to it are named after it. It overtopped Route 2, flooded out the Good Food store inside and out. I personally saw 2 dead cars here and more that appeared to have spent the night in the gas station across the street. And that gas station eventually ran out of fuel. Then there's, of course, the Sunday River. Many people visit Sunday River Resort for decades before realizing it's named after a river, so we'll get to that. Then the Bear River and Route 26 was absolutely devastated as it came out of Grafton Notch. This took weeks to reopen fully. It's totally worth the trip to the DOT YouTube page to see the drone footage of this, and it overtopped Route 2 at the intersection there as well. The Ellis River and Route 5 towards Andover is still, it's not missing the bridge, as Joyce informed me. The bridge is still there, but the approach to the bridge is still missing, and so you cannot get to Andover on Route 5. And the Swift River coming into Rumford, Mexico, that was the highest level ever recorded, and 2 people did die here as they got swept away in the floodwaters. So that's my brief summary of 5 to 7 inches of rain. The ground was frozen, no snow in town, snow in the mountains, yes. I think you saw on the slide that the Bethel Fire Department, which is just a small portion of that area, did 27 water rescues on like Monday night into Tuesday. So this is an image of the village. This is a drone shot of the village looking at, so many of you, if you've visited Bethel, you've probably come in from the south on Route 26. We're not talking a little culvert overtopped here. We're talking it was completely submerged for at least half a mile, going about halfway up the hill as you come into town. I've circled the CMP substation. Yes, great place for that. Right there in the middle of the flood. Right next to it is the wastewater treatment plant. The employees here had to cut the fence to escape that facility on the uphill side. And so because of that treatment plant, or I'm sorry, the substation being where it is, we lost power in the village for 2 days. I cannot even express to you how rare that is. The village is where we take care of all the people from the outskirts when they lose power. To lose this absolute core of our community for 2 full days of power loss. I mean, this is low-income apartments. This is our main grocery store, only one for 20 miles. Elementary school, this is fire station, town office, hundreds of residences, inns, restaurants, et cetera, to no power for 2 days. And nobody, and of course, with that amount of water, no way to get anybody in to help. Nothing to do but sit there and wait. So, yeah, another picture. This is looking the other way. 3 businesses down there, totally gutted. 2 popular restaurants and a kids' dance studio. There's the Alder River. As you can see, it's a lake all the way back to Mount Abram. And yeah, a better view of the substation and the wastewater treatment plant. So next we have our in-town trails. So the Bethel Pathway, look at this beautiful December day, right? Should be tons of snow, should be snowmobiles. No, it's completely washed out, eaten away. That's the only way to get a snowmobile trail across the Androscoggin for miles and miles, if anywhere. So that is a problem. And so this middle picture is a very recent, long sought-after extension to the Bethel pathway. It wasn't paved, it was gravelled, but as you see, all the gravel's washed away. We have a 6-foot-tall guy there, knee-deep in just the water. That was probably Wednesday. And then the Bethel Inn Golf Course, huge hole. That should be a cross-country ski trail at that time of year. And then, of course, we get to Sunday River. This made the news in my Google alerts all the way to Honolulu. On the upper right there is the Grand Summit Hotel access road. You probably heard about that in the news. People were stranded there for, I think, 30 hours, so almost a couple days. Hundreds of guests and staff stuck there, could not leave this road. On the landslide on the Gould Academy Competition Center, so that's a whole separate facility where, like, the local academy like prepares for races and stores all their stuff. Like, a landslide went through the building. What you see is about halfway up what should be a bank of doors and windows and came out the other side. And then the lower picture is Southridge. That's the main base area. I wish there was someone standing in that hole so you could see how deep it was. And even if you could leave the resort for those couple days, the road itself, you know, a couple miles into the resort, was overtopped into 2 different places. So no one could get in or out even if they tried. So in summary, physical devastation, emotional trauma, fear, outrageous expense, loss of homes, few lives and livelihoods. Plenty more will get discovered in the spring. Right now, we had a few storms. Everything is all like smoothed over and patched up, but boy, we are just getting started on some of this stuff. But I did have a story that this crowd will appreciate. A neighbor told me that he helped someone out by powering a sump pump with his Ford Lightning. So there.
That was fantastic. Thanks. And I just want to express appreciation to Jesse and Gary and Kathleen for bringing the community stories forward. I think it's so important that we're hearing from the people who were right there experiencing all the damage that's occurred in the last few months. It's just hard to comprehend that our state has gone through this, so thank you for sharing all of that. Today, I wanted to just briefly cover some of the things that the Department of Environmental Protection has been involved in. First is related to home heating oil tanks. So an area of work that many people don't know about the department is that we have about 24 trained oil and hazardous material responders that are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, on call to respond when there's a release of oil or hazardous materials in the state. And so when the rivers flooded in December, unfortunately for many of the homeowners who had tanks in their basements or attached to the sides of their homes, those tanks floated. They ripped off of their pipes, they flipped over, and they spilled oil all over the place. And so at the department, we received about as many calls in 1 week as we normally do in the course of 3 months. And so just a quick statistic, we respond to about 1 home heating oil tank spill per day under normal circumstances. So if greenhouse gas emissions wasn't a reason to think about getting off of heating oil as a home heating source, I'd suggest you go and take a look at your tank if you have one. I would put that in the category of things that we were kind of prepared for. So good news is that our responders are trained. They are trained and prepared to respond to emergencies. That's their shtick. On the other side, on terms of coastal damage that's occurred in January, what we were not prepared for is how to deal with all the structural damage, like what Kathleen and Gary described, where piers and wharves have been washed away, buildings have been destabilized and undermined, and as Kathleen said, there are requirements for permits from both the state and the federal government, and we know we can't get those permits issued fast enough to get people back to work. And so we are working very hard right now to figure out what kind of adjustments we can make to our requirements, to the rules that apply, and to the laws that apply, so that we can make some smart decisions about enabling people in the state of Maine to do what they need to do to make their properties more more resilient. We are currently working on a bill LD 2030. It will be in work session tomorrow in the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. It started out as a wee little bill that was introduced by the department with a fortunate bit of foresight that maybe we ought to do something about allowing debris to be cleared from streams in a flood emergency, and that maybe we should let people raise their docks and their piers by a couple of feet to prepare for storm events. Now, in hindsight, fortunately, we have that bill as an opportunity to make some additional changes, given all the lessons that we're currently learning. So I'm looking forward to learning more from you all today and to this conversation.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Governor Mills, for calling this. I can tell you that on December 18th, around 7 o'clock in the morning, our bridge maintenance engineer called me and said, "Joyce, it's Armageddon in Western Maine." Now, if you know bridge engineers, they're not known for being dramatic. They're like this. And I knew immediately with his tone and his voice we were in trouble. And they were really struggling to even get to bridges in Western Maine. They were shut off, Jesse knows. We couldn't get to resources. It was really unlike anything I think Maine DOT has seen. We literally ran out of barrels and cones during this storm. I think that as the water receded, we found out what was damaged. We were very, very fortunate, which is probably hard to hear for some people because it doesn't feel fortunate, but we did not lose a bridge. We lost a number of bridge approaches. Bridges would have been much more devastating. So that was good. We lost a lot of roads. The crews were out there. We had construction folks out there working with us. We had over 100 closures at one point on the system, and you're seeing, some of the western Maine damage. And when we have 100 closures, guess what can't happen? Power restoration. They can't get there. EMS can't get there. So it's really critical that the roads open or that we find detours or we figure out how to get people there. It was really all hands on deck, and nobody was worrying about engineering standards at that point. It was get it done. So that was, it's been interesting because Hannah knows a lot of times I get asked about damage and what DOT is preparing to do, and I always say, don't forget inland. Don't forget inland. We've had some big storms over the years where we've lost pieces of infrastructure, not to this extent, but we're very vulnerable inland, in my opinion. We have many old culverts that are very much undersized. I always get asked by the Transportation Committee at the legislature, what keeps you up at night? It is not bridges. We have a good bridge inspection program. Our bridges are safe. Culverts getting washed out, slopes getting washed out, and people driving through there not knowing there is nothing there scares me. That's what I worry about. The coastal storms, we had a lot of flooding. We still have 2 roads that are out, 2 bridges that are still out in Western Maine. The good news is about 10 years ago, the department decided to upsize culverts and bridges. We did it because we were seeing storm events. I will tell you, we were getting pressure to do more fish passage, and so we sort of felt like it was a win-win that, we did fish passage to help other agencies out, and we increased our sizes of our culverts and our bridges. We took some heat for that 10 years ago. There were a lot of people who were very upset that we were overspending money. I'm feeling pretty good about that right now, I'll just tell you. And we didn't lose any of that new infrastructure. Anything that has been upsized did not get lost. And I know Brian has told me that towns have told him the ones that have followed our design standards to upsize did not lose those pieces of infrastructure. So I think one of the things we have to do is figure out how to help municipalities be able to afford those larger projects because they are more expensive. We are spending more money. It's about twice or even 3 times as much money. But is it worth it? I think these 3 town managers would say yes. The other thing that is really good is about when the BIL program was coming out, Commissioner Van Note said, go find 7 areas that are flooding consistently now, get them engineered so we can go for discretionary federal money. One is for Kathleen, the Deer Isle Stonington Causeway. We're well along. Thank you to Kathleen's leadership helping us get there. These are complex projects. There's a lot of community issues in them. I don't know if we've shown the Machias video yet, because I lost track of this, but do we have the Machias video? Do we not have that? Okay.
Emailed it out to everybody.
Okay, all right. Oh, yeah, it's in the invitation, right? Machias is a project we've been working on for over 10 years to try to work on that causeway. These things are complex because if we raise the causeway 2 feet or 4 feet, we could cause back flooding into the town of Machias. So you can't just look at one asset, you have to look at the system. And we're really not set up to do that, to be honest, and I think it's something with Hannah's group, we're beginning to have those conversations. So there's still a lot of work for us because, yes, DOT can go in and raise a bridge or a road, but if we're gonna flood somebody else out or it's gonna be high and dry and no one else can use it, is that where we should spend the money? So those are the kinds of conversations that we're having.
Hi, everyone. I appreciate being here today on behalf of Commissioner Kelleher, who would have liked to have been here himself. He's in Washington this week. Overall, I want to emphasize the absolutely unprecedented nature of these coastal storms. Everywhere we've gone in the last couple of weeks, people have said, I've lived here 70 years, I've never seen anything like it. Or I'm 87, I've never seen weather like this. The photos here do show, some of the most visible damage that we've seen. These are photos that were provided from various Marine Patrol officers mostly. But across every harbor, wharves are compromised or listing, gear was lost and damaged. There's extensive work to be done. And much of the damage really isn't visible from roads or higher shore. I also think there's probably still much remaining to be found. We think the next storm could show that many more structures were compromised than we originally understood. So as I mentioned, the impacts are devastating, they're vast. Almost all of these wharves are privately owned by individuals, families, or co-ops. And until there are repairs made, these inefficiencies are going to have ripple effects throughout the harbors and communities and supply chains of the marine economy. Many people noted that they were glad that this storm happened in January rather than October, when the impacts would have been vastly greater because many more boats would have been fishing. But fishermen, as Kathleen noted, fishermen intend to keep fishing. And we've heard clearly from the major buying stations that they need to be up and running by May, even if they won't be fully operational. The businesses know that they need to be working or constraints will be felt throughout the local community's economy. Thankfully, most municipal piers did not sustain significant damage, perhaps reflecting greater investment and opportunities available to fund resiliency upgrades in those facilities. So in some communities, they will be able to serve some of the need. However, those lost access points cannot be made up by any one single pier. This is an important point to underscore, as we know resources available for repair and reconstruction of private infrastructure are going to be limited. DMR has never been involved in natural disaster response in the past, at least in my tenure there in 12 years. However, it's clear that most federal disaster assistance is focused on housing and public infrastructure, and as such won't be of much significant value to the seafood businesses impacted. Further, the loan programs unlocked by disaster declarations will be slow to arrive, perhaps too slow to be of much value given that the sector has an urgent need to rebuild, as Melanie mentioned. The reality is that in some cases, rebuilding, the fastest and cheapest thing we can do to rebuild is to do so as prior to the storm. But coastal Maine really shouldn't miss the opportunity to make these facilities more resilient to future storms. We're grateful for the coordination with DEP to try to achieve that. And we know that these future storms are coming on top of documented and predicted sea level rise. And as Joyce mentioned, we saw in the December 18th storm, these investments make a real difference. Those upgraded culverts sustain far less damage. And we know that what those solutions are. We just need the resources available to implement them more quickly.
Thanks, Meredith. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the inland, because Meredith did a lot of work on the coastal. So this is actually a spinning mill. Those shipping containers are full of materials. And the water doesn't flow that way. You can't see the whole thing, but the water actually flows this way. And so the force of the water was strong enough to tip over completely full shipping containers. And so I think one of the surprises for this storm, along the rivers, was the speed at which these rivers were moving and the force that they were creating. And so that's a little bit different from some of the other storms we're seeing, the speed at which the rivers rose and the force at which they had. We had a number of people who were fortunate not to be hurt worse, but had to be kind of rescued
they were trying to rescue their businesses and needed to be rescued out themselves because of the speed and the just how aggressive the water was moving. So I think that's a big thing. Some of the work that we're seeing is, you'll see in these next few pictures, is just what range of impacts there were. So that was kind of more of an in-town structural, sits next to a hydro asset on purpose so that it can pull hydropower. Here you're looking at kind of recreational assets, including campgrounds and outdoor recreation locations. And then in the next pictures, you'll see impacts on trail infrastructure. And so, as we think about who was impacted, particularly in the central and western part of the state, almost everyone, right? There were impacts to multiple different aspects of our economy, and that's just looking at the economy, not looking at the residents that were impacted as well. If you go to those communities today, we're 35 days, 36 days, depending on when the river crested where you are. There are still dumpsters in these neighborhoods that people are trying to figure out what to do, right? Melanie's quick response team were amazing at getting out and helping people who did have oil spills. The challenge is, how do you get those houses heated? How do you get them cleaned out in a safe way? If they aren't working and they're not drawing a paycheck, how are they fixing these properties? We know people are living in places that are unsafe. And so as we think about support and resiliency, there's a speed and efficiency to that as well, because when that happens to your business or your home, right, you need to fix it quickly. We have businesses that actually weren't impacted, their production wasn't impacted, but New Balance as an example, and this is a public example, they lost significant amounts of raw material. And so they've had their teams on leave since the December 18th storm because they don't have raw materials to make product. And they're fortunately, right, they have the capacity to continue to pay the employees and keep them on staff. And so we appreciate, right, the private sector really investing in their people there to keep them safe and able to continue to fund what's going on at their homes. But they lost raw materials that are significant. And so as we think about storm impacts, it's not necessarily just about the building. It could be about raw materials. Does resiliency work or not? Is it more expensive? Probably. But there are a couple of manufacturers that sit along the Kennebec River that will tell you that their investment was worth it. So to get a loan from a bank, they had to map out their manufacturing equipment around the floodplain. And so it's interesting, their offices flooded and were a mess, but they could still be in production because they literally mapped out their manufacturing line to work around the floodplain. And so, we can see this happen in places, and obviously those will change and they'll need to move things. But for this storm, they were able to see the direct impact of that. Obviously, there's more costs to setting up their manufacturing system that way, a little bit more cost. But certainly they are back in production and able to ship products. So that resiliency did work. More to do there. Lots, as you can see, lots more trail infrastructure. And as we think about the long-term impacts of some of this trail infrastructure on a variety of businesses, it's really hard to pick who's impacted where as you're looking at this trail infrastructure because, Jesse was talking about it, right? Like, they should be snowmobiling on these trails. And now we have snow, but there's no trail infrastructure and there are no bridges. We're seeing more accidents, probably more challenges for the game wardens to get out and help and keep people safe because the bridge they expected to be there isn't there. So I would say, as we look at it, the impacts are much more diverse than they've ever been and impact a lot more both businesses and residents. And so thanks to the communities for coming to talk about that work because it will be the cornerstone of how these businesses and residents rebuild.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much to the leadership of Governor Mills and the administration, just to the folks in this room. I don't have any pictures to share. But as we are looking at these pictures and these photos and the comments that are being made, I think it really underscores the impact on the infrastructure and the communities across Maine. But I think I heard folks mention it, but what's really difficult to depict is the human toll these extreme weather climate events have had on people. And what does that mean, right? What is the human toll? It's that fear, it's the suffering that people are going to, but it's also the impact on health. I wanted to sort of frame it for everybody a bit more. I started my tenure as Maine CDC director in August of 2023, late August of 2023. In the 5-ish months that I've been here, Maine has seen the impact of air quality because of fires from up north. We have seen extreme heat alerts as a result of extreme heat. And then in less than a period of 4 weeks, we saw 3 successive storms that brought in catastrophic flooding. That is just in the 5-ish months that I've started my tenure. So what does that mean, and what does that look like for the impact on health and our ability to provide health services and public health services to the population? In the 3 storms themselves, what we experienced and what our folks and teams at Maine CDC and working with others across DHHS, what we saw were the impacts of extreme temperature, extreme cold. What happened in the December 18th storm and the successive storms is that people lost electricity, which I heard, right? What does that mean within the homes? It meant that there were vulnerable populations, vulnerable people, vulnerable grandmas and grandpas, and families who could not stay warm, possibly, right? Or they were reliant on a fireplace, or they were reliant on generators. But what did that mean when we adapted with generators? What we saw an increase in carbon monoxide exposure and poisoning as people were trying to adapt because of the loss of electricity and extreme cold temperatures. The other thing that we see that may not be immediate is even the increased risk of infectious diseases and our need to monitor for that. What I mean by that is what we saw in these 3 successive storms, especially the December 18th one, is we saw the impact on our drinking water systems and our septic systems. What does that mean? It means that there were communities that did not have access to drinkable water, and that we had to monitor for waterborne illnesses because of the impact of flooding. Even access, and I heard this in the comments made, access to healthcare, health services, and treatment were impacted. If you lived on the wrong side of that washed out roads, then can you get to the clinic? Can you get to urgent care? Can EMS get to you? Can you get to dialysis? Those things can't wait. Can you get to your cancer treatment? In addition to that, our public health nurses had difficulty accessing and bringing treatment to people that really needed treatment and care. And then last, what we notice and what we are seeing is the mental toll that this has on people. What the science shows us, and it's building already, the evidence is building, is that these extreme weather events, these extreme climate events, these events in this rapid succession, it really does take a mental toll. And people without a history of anxiety and depression, what happens is it makes people more vulnerable to anxiety and depression. It also makes people more vulnerable to turn to unhealthy negative coping mechanisms. And we are seeing that now. We see the need for it right now. I know Maine is resilient. I hear it. I see it. I've experienced it. But I think what I need to do and what Maine CDC and our partners, my job is to really focus this work on the impact on people and the health of people as we're facing this. What happens is, even though we are resilient, as we put more effort, more often, more vigorously to maintain that level of resilience, that too has an impact on health. And we have to be better prepared to be able to face unfortunately, this current reality and the challenges right now, because we know, and I've heard it, we are expecting these severe climate events to happen more often. Thank you.
Thank you. So thinking about that, our energy system, how we power our economy, how we get to work, and then how we live our lives requires energy. It requires electricity. It requires fuels. And Maine has historically experienced among the greatest frequency and duration of power outages in the country. We're a large rural state. We have many trees that can down power lines. We have extreme weather. So it's something that is not abnormal to Maine. But one utility representative said to us, this December storm in particular was among the worst we've experienced in recent memory, and the damage was extensive and widespread. So putting this into context, 26 years ago, we had the ice storm of '98. we hit records of power outages with 380,000 outages statewide 26 years ago. In 2017, the Halloween windstorm knocked out over 400,000 ratepayers, setting a new record. So 380 ice storm, 400 during the Halloween storm of 2017. The December storm outages were 452,000 outages across the state. So we think about the context of each of those storms, obviously different, obviously challenging in their own ways, but we're seeing more and more of this, and we're seeing broader impacts on the electricity system. Versant, one of our major utilities, told us that they had 269 broken utility poles across both storms. Think about that, 269 broken poles in a month, and what it takes to fix those, and what happens there. And so I think as we're thinking about how we're planning for that so it's the electricity side, but it's also the fuel delivery side. So the governor signed 2 energy emergency proclamations to ensure that drivers could be on the roads longer to deal with some of the issues, to deliver fuels to gas stations, to heat people's homes. Typically in the past, those have been when we've had really extreme snowstorms. It's taken folks longer to get around the roads and otherwise. But this time, we heard a lot of reports from across the country that they couldn't get to gas stations. They couldn't get to fuel depots. There were longer lines. There were power outages. And so we need to be planning not just for the electricity for how we're powering our homes, but the impacts to those fuel stations. I do want to, with that, note that the governor in 2021 proposed and ultimately signed legislation requiring our utilities to put forward climate change protection plans in 2021. Those first plans were filed in between those 2 storms, so the end of last year. So as we're looking forward, what do we do about climate change? How are we preparing for climate change? I think we need to be looking to how we're planning our energy systems together. Those plans are now out in the public for public comment. They are going to be filed every 3 years. That's the first time in Maine's history, and frankly, I think in the country, that type of work has happened. And I think it's incumbent on us to think about our utility systems. Where are our substations? Where are our wastewater treatment plants? And to work collectively on those plans together, so that as we're thinking about the resiliency of our state, we are planning for the future of our electric system in that same way as well.
Thanks, Dan. Governor, thank you. Climate Council, thank you for putting this up. This is extremely timely and extremely important. In less than 1 month between December 18th and January 13th, Maine experienced 3 unprecedented and devastating storms. Looking back over the last 12 months, Maine has had at least 3 additional disasters and a hurricane that narrowly missed the state. Something has changed. The days of single event storms such as a blizzard or windstorm resulting in major disaster once every few years seems to be over. Now we face multi-hazard events, including rain, wind, storm surge, flash flooding, coastal flooding, and major power outages more frequently and with much more intensity. And we received all of that the past 3 storms. More than ever, Maine people have been forced to confront the consequences of climate change. It's here, and it can no longer be ignored. Warmer temperatures are contributing to more frequent and more intense storms, bringing flash and coastal flooding, similar to what pounded the rivers and coastline in numerous counties over the past month. In the latest coastal storm, Portland received its highest tide ever, a half-inch higher than the previous record dating back to 1978. Another clear sign of this weather shift is the flooding Stonington and Deer Isle causeways, which were under 18 inches of water. That's astounding just to even think about that. Homeowners and businesses now need to weigh the consequences of rebuilding in the same location versus building higher and stronger, or even relocating. Recent weather events have highlighted an extremely concerning reality for Maine. If we fail to mitigate these hazards and build resiliency, the same outcome will be realized time and time again. Any reconstruction in flood-prone and disaster-prone areas needs to be given some serious thought. We as a state understand that a lot of our coastal communities are vulnerable. Other storms over the last 12 months have shown us that inland communities are vulnerable as well, and thank you for all the communities for being here today. We need to take a hard look at how we can work collectively to mitigate the hazards that we can and how we can build resiliency where we cannot. MEMA will be here to help communities navigate the ever-growing list of available federal assistance programs, like FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, BRIC, or the new programs like the Swift Current program that provides funding to mitigate buildings following a flood to reduce the risk of future flood damage. MEMA is committed to working with Maine communities as they navigate this journey of change. Really appreciate everybody's time. And Hannah, is this where the mic drop happens?
Yeah, your mic drop. Well, thank you, Pete, and thank you to the whole panel. We're not going to have everybody answer this question because we want to transition to our science and Vermont experts while the governor is still here, but maybe just throw it out there that the question of the hour, the question of this meeting is how do we build greater resilience? And I think a number of you started talking about it, whether it's new FEMA funds, whether it's permitting, whether it's larger culverts, utilities doing the planning work. Is there anything else folks want to throw out there? We're going to talk about this as a climate council for the next time, the next hour or so that we're here, but just want to see, especially from our community leaders or other commissioners or leaders, if you have anything you want to use to start the conversation. How do we build greater resilience? Kathleen, going to put you on the spot? Sure. You got the answer? It's on.
I think one of the things to realize is at least for me, and I mentioned it before, what we thought we had to do, it's way more. What I was looking at for sea level rise or anything else, it is way more than what we expected. It is coming on faster, and it's going to cost more. And also, too, the effects on communities, losing those businesses, not being able to build back fast enough. And I think the other thing is, too, is the gentrification that I'm afraid will happen because, we will lose the 20 miles of working waterfront that we have. How do we as coastal communities hold on to that? That is my biggest fear, and we need to stay ahead of that.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in? Jesse.
I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but one thing that happened to us was after the water and the power after the power and the internet came back on, our entire town water district, 500,000 gallons of water disappeared. We had a leak in the system somewhere. So the restaurants spent the day throwing away all their food from the freezer because none of them have generators in the village. Started being like, yes, we're getting ready to go for Christmas. And I will also say that for this storm happening when it did right before Christmas, for those of you on the coast, imagine that those storms that happened to you happened on July 1st. Your main season was well underway, and that there's this extra surge of people coming for peak season. They're already packed up and they're on their way. That's what Christmas is like for us, and so to lose that week is just absolutely financially devastating. Sunday River was completely closed for 4 days leading up to Christmas, maybe longer, and took another 2-3 weeks to get back to where they were before they closed. And again, that's just all frozen over, patched up, and we'll deal with the rest in the spring. So it's somehow we have to wrestle with the idea of recovering and planning ahead at the same time. We lost our water, electricity, internet. We don't have any sort of municipal fuel or anything like that, but just an unbelievable amount of work.
So figuring out how to do it all at once. Any resilience solutions down there?
I think I might also think about new technology opportunities in resiliency. We have technology like energy storage and solar and backup that we can be looking at for whether it's our hospitals or community buildings and assets to make sure that those important places in our community have some of that resiliency built in, and thinking about how we kind of build and plan for that. There's federal funding, tax credits, all of those things. So I think thinking about the resiliency of some of those things up front where possible would be a good focus area.
maybe we could challenge the meteorological community if you can predict the river level, if we can predict storm surge as well. It's not going to save the piers, but it could get some equipment out of the way.
Great. And the work that your community and others have done to monitor river levels has obviously saved lives. So how do we make sure that we have that in every community that's vulnerable? Well, with that, I'm going to ask you all to stay in your seats. We have a few more minutes of the governor's time while she's here, but I'm going to pass it off to Melanie, who are going to introduce two guests who are going to start us on the path ahead, which is a conversation we'll continue for the rest of the afternoon. So, Melanie.
Thank you, Hannah. All right, I think this thing is still on. So, as we've now covered our experiences that have happened in the last couple of months, we have a couple of people who we'd like to have provide you with some brief presentations who will be with us for the remainder of the meeting. But just in brief, to hear from our friends in Vermont who might know a little bit about flooding, and we'd like to learn from some of their experiences and the things that they've been doing to recover from some of the horrible devastation that happened in Vermont a few years ago. So we'd like to welcome Secretary Julie Moore. And then following her, we'll also hear from our scientists, Dr. Susie Arnold, to help us answer that question of what do we need to prepare for? I think we've heard recognition today that, as Kathleen said, what we were planning for maybe wasn't enough. And so maybe it won't be our meteorologists, but some of our scientists may help to give us an idea of what we need to shoot for as we talk about how to build back better.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julie Moore. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, although I wish it was under better circumstances. I have three images that I will move through quickly here that I hope offer sort of a series of vignettes about the work Vermont has been engaged in intentionally since we were devastated by Tropical Storm Irene in 2011, and then the dividends that this work paid this July when we experienced our most significant flooding since Irene. Although the photo that's on the slide right now may not appear as such, this is actually shows both floodplain restoration and infrastructure hardening in action this July. The Winooski River is just behind the line of trees on the upper right-hand corner of this image, and the Waterbury State Office Complex is the brick buildings at center top. This is a facility that was devastated by Irene flooding and was closed for the better part of 5 years following that storm event, but fared much better during the July floods and was able to actually reopen within 2 weeks of when that picture was taken. Between Irene and the July floods, 22 buildings totaling more than 300,000 square feet closest to the river in the space where you sort of see those arcs of trees were demolished. Fill was removed. You can actually see that there's a historic chimney that was associated with the heat plant for that complex. We left the chimney in place, but the rest of that structure was removed. And the floodplain was largely reconnected to the river and performed admirably in this instance. We also raised all of the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems in those buildings and filled the basement with flowable concrete, creating a building that's theoretically flood-proof to the 500-year flood level. And then finally replanted about 1,000 feet of riverfront with trees. There were some really good trees already there, which is largely what's seen in the image. But off the right-hand side of the screen, there were additional river plantings. Let's see if I push. Oh, somebody else is doing it. Great. The next piece is looking at resilient roads and infrastructure. In following Tropical Storm Irene, Vermont updated its town highway road and bridge standards to promote more durable and resilient roads and infrastructure. And we've also worked to put in place a set of incentives to help overcome local resistance to the higher upfront costs that a couple of the speakers referred to of meeting these standards. This set of images says a lot to me. This is a small stream called the Jail Branch in Orange, Vermont. There are two culverts sort of right next door to each other. One on the right-hand side of the image was replaced following Tropical Storm Irene with that arch section that you can see in the lower image. And the upstream culvert remained in place. It was woefully undersized and did not survive our July flood events. The ways that we're helping provide incentives to communities to make the sort of replacements you see on the right-hand side, two come immediately to mind. One is what we refer to as our Emergency Relief and Assistance, or ERAF program, which is used to reduce the local cost share needed to match federal public assistance following a federally declared disaster if a community makes an ongoing commitment to installing right-sized structures. And then we've also secured a commitment from FEMA. To my knowledge, this is still novel in the country. Well, they'll actually cover the additional cost of rebuilding previously substandard roads and structures to meet our town, our newly adopted town highway road and bridge standards, as opposed to in-kind replacement. And in exchange for that commitment from FEMA, we have made a commitment that we will only use bridges and culverts that meet those new sizing standards. And then the final image I have is one that speaks to wetland protection and restoration. The Agency of Natural Resources has really placed considerable emphasis on wetland protection and restoration since Tropical Storm Irene. In that time, we've acquired and conserved more than 4,000 acres, largely of marginal farmlands that is actively at this point being restored to wetlands. And these projects are a veritable win-win-win in that they support landscape level resilience, they improve water quality, and they also create migratory bird habitat, because this is all, the blue on to the left-hand side of that image is the bottomlands of Lake Champlain, and so this is a significant migratory bird corridor. The watershed shown on your screen is that of the Otter Creek. It actually flows from south to north, and there are two gauges marked on the map, a Rutland stream gauge towards the lower third and the Middlebury stream gauge up at the top. The watershed area at Middlebury is more than double the watershed area as the Otter Creek passes through Rutland. Yet if you look at those flow hydrographs during our July storm events, you can see that the peak flow in Middlebury was actually less than half what it was in Rutland. And that is a tribute to all of the green and purple areas along that river, some of which were natural wetlands that had been protected through regulatory programs. Excuse me, and some of which are restored wetlands that the agency has invested in over the last dozen years. I look forward to being able to share a little bit more with you all about Vermont's experience, but just wanted to sort of give a sense for what we see as the art of the possible in the 12 years that have elapsed in Vermont since Tropical Storm Irene. Thanks.
Here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susie Arnold. I'm the Senior Ocean Scientist at the Island Institute. I've been asked to talk about the link between climate change and the recent storms in one slide, so forgive me if I don't include everything. The last month's storms have hit home what we've been talking about for years. We are now living in a world of extremes, and this is the new normal. In the Northeast, we're seeing storms with more intense rainfalls, storms with high surface winds from the southeast. The December 18th storm was an example of this. We saw 5 to 7 inches of rain in western Maine, high winds, over 70-mile-an-hour gusts in some areas, on top of a warmer winter that kept the ground from freezing, higher soil moisture due to chronic increased wetness, in watersheds that were already full and thawed. This combination led to some of the worst inland flooding in the state since the 1980s, and as mentioned by Dan, impacts to the electrical grid comparable to the 1998 ice storm with over half the state without electricity. Moving up to the upper right, then came the early January storms. I'll use the Portland tide gauge for brevity. The January 10 event was a confluence of southeast winds, which are particularly damaging to our coast. Rain, snowmelt, with peak storm surge close to the high tide. This event is now a 1 in 5 year event, meaning there is a 20% chance of it happening in each year under current conditions. This will become more often as seas continue to rise. The Saturday, January 13th event broke water level records in Portland. This is a 1 in 90 year event and is what we've been warning about, a large surge coinciding with an astronomical high tide and the rising seas in the backdrop. The impacts were so severe because these storms are coming on top of higher sea level. This is the new normal. These events were not a surprise. We're measuring sea level rise in Maine and have been for about 100 years. The state now has sea level rise planning guidance thanks to Maine Won't Wait, our 2020 climate action plan. We're committed to manage for 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050. Based on the best available science coming out of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, this guidance is still accurate. What we need to do is communicate the science that we have, apply that science, and continue to collect it to improve Maine's resiliency. Thank you.
Okay. So, let me give you a mic.
Yeah, I probably ought to be asking a meteorologist, or I should be asking a weather person. One of the novel features of these storms was the southeasterly winds. And why did that happen? Why? We're used to northeasters, and the dairy barns were positioned, for instance, to withstand northeasterly winds. Southeasterly winds hit us. Again, I should be asking the meteorologist, but do you have any idea how that happened to change?
Well, we have a few people who are more qualified to answer that in the room. However, I think the jury is still out. We have been seeing an increased trend of storms coming from the southeast and these really high surface winds from that direction, which, as you said, is particularly damaging to Maine. I think I can say confidently that we're not sure yet. I'll be going into a little bit more of the data around storms and some of the uncertainty around those trends. The sea level rise trend, fairly obvious, it's going up. The storm trend is a little bit less clear. Sean Burkle, Ivan Fernandez, Steve Dixon, Pete Slavinsky, many of you are here in the room. If you have something else to add, please chime in.
Nothing else? We're not sure. We're not sure. Okay, that's a good answer. Okay, so we want to thank the governor for being here. It was mine, but it's okay. You can keep it. It's a keepsake. We can invite our panel to find their seats in the room. Governor, you're welcome to stay. We're going to have a little conversation here among the Climate Council. We're going to ask Secretary Moore and Susie to give us a little more detail on their presentations. So I invite you, if you're able to, we understand you got to go. But thank you, Governor. I want to do a round of applause. Thanks. Getting a standing ovation. Okay, fantastic. All right, actually that was great. You all got a chance to stand up and stretch your legs a little bit. Thank you for that. All right, we're gonna keep rolling forward. As I mentioned, if anybody's crashing on sugar, there's some cookies over on this side of the room. There's restrooms out the back. Feel free to do that. All right, we wanna have a conversation with the council, but we wanna do one thing or really two things first. Secretary Julie Moore from Vermont and Susie Arnold both have a little bit more detail to offer us. And we thought it would be helpful to do that. We've asked them to do, 5 to 10 minutes each. because Vermont has more than what Secretary Moore just showed us. They've got some clever ideas, and we want to get those out in the room before we get our conversation going. And Susie's going to give us a little bit more detail, even though we don't know exactly why we have the southeasterly winds. We do know a few things, and I think that's important to get out on the table. So if folks are up for it, we're going to do, another 10 to 20 minutes of some presentations, and then we're going to have a conversation about what do we need to do as a council and get ready and give some guidance to our working groups about what we're expecting from them when they come to us in June with some recommendations for updates to the Climate Action Plan. Okay? So that's what we're going to do for the next hour or so that we've got. And I'm going to ask Secretary Moore to come up and kick us off with this. And you've got some more slides here. You can run your own slides, Secretary Moore, by that big green button.
Perfect.
Okay.
Excellent. So thank you again for having me and having me back. This first image is of a road that was washed out this July. Our river engineers estimate about 30,000 cubic yards of material was lost, and that this washout extends a quarter of a mile. Perhaps most ironically is upstream of that is a culvert that was plugged. That same culvert had plugged during Tropical Storm Irene. The culvert itself wasn't damaged, so FEMA declined to replace it, and we find ourselves in this situation. Whoops. Well, we can just go there. So I thought I would start with a few facts and figures about Vermont, just to give you a little context. I'll then touch on our approach to adaptation, what I think of as some of our key tools and approaches, and then we are also evolving and learning in response to these most recent flood events, and can talk a little bit about what our next steps are. So Vermont is a land area about a quarter the size of Maine. We have about 650,000 people who call Vermont home. We have 256 municipalities. There are also 30 incorporated villages and essentially no county government. And that may be an important distinction here in that it's certainly something that challenges us in emergency response. We're also, most of our towns are very, very small. We don't have any communities with more than 50,000 people, and only 4%, 11 of our communities have more than 10,000 residents. We also have a lot of water, about 7,000 miles of rivers and streams. We like to think of ourselves as the west coast of New England, with Lake Champlain running down most of the western edge of the state. And within those, or along those 7,000 miles of rivers and streams, we have about 209,000 acres of mapped riparian areas that are regulated by 274 different municipal entities in terms of the FEMA mapped flood hazard areas, and there's more than 12,000 structures that are located within those flood hazard areas. In addition, we have about 250,000 acres of mapped wetlands and more than 800 known dams, many of which are in various stages of decay. Whoop, I'm going backwards. How? That one? Oh, there we go. So the image on the left hand of the side of the screen is actually a copy of a hard copy map that's kept by our river management team that shows the rough extent of flood events that have occurred across Vermont over the last 40 years. The pie chart tells us a similar story in that we've had an average of one federally declared flood disaster in the state every year since 1990. And it's no wonder that our state hazard mitigation plan therefore lists flooding and flood-related erosion as our top natural hazards in Vermont. So in terms of how we are approaching our work at this point, I sort of put it into two big buckets. The first is thinking about fast, effective response and what that means to early recovery. And then there is the long-term work of building resilience. In terms of fast, effective response and early recovery, we have created emergency authorities, many of which sit with our rivers management team. They're able to issue essentially on the spot next flood protection measures that are in effect immediate permits to allow for targeted in-stream work. We had essentially a free-for-all following Tropical Storm Irene with a lot of unnecessary dredging and digging that was done in our river system, and it created long-term damage as well as risk to downstream communities. So we've really worked hard over the last 12 years to build those strong relationships between the state's river management engineers and particularly local road foremen. I would now say, maybe not fully, but largely look at us as a resource in these times of crisis and seek advice. And we had much better outcomes, I would argue, as a result this July. We've also deployed the Survey 123 app, both through our transportation agency as well as the river engineers, and that allows damage to be reported from the field immediately and consistently into our State Emergency Operations Center. We created a recovery unit within the SEOC, which is actually embedded with that disaster response team, which again helps to facilitate the collection of disaster damages in order to expedite our requests for federal disaster declarations, and also assists in that transition from disaster response to recovery, making it more smooth. And finally, we've created a local liaisons program working with our RPCs, our regional planning commissions, and it allows them to provide capacity to our 274 municipal entities in doing damage assessments immediately following the flood event. In terms of building long-term resilience, I really like this figure on the right-hand side of the screen. It's thinking about how you avoid the unmanageable risks and manage the unavoidable risks. So in terms of avoiding the unmanageable, this is things like hazard mitigation and specifically buyouts, land use planning and regulation, as well as investing in nature-based solutions like the Waterbury State Office Complex example I spoke to earlier. In managing the unavoidable, this is about flood-proofing and hardening buildings. In particular, about a third of Vermont's wastewater facilities saw damage this July from high flow events, including 3 facilities that are assumed to be a total loss and will need replacement. And that flood-proofing work is going to be really important going forward, along with designing and maintaining reliable infrastructure, thinking specifically about not just bridges and culverts, but also dams, and making sure that we're designing not just for current conditions, but the anticipated future conditions. In terms of our key tools and approaches, a big piece of it has been aligning state programs, funding, and incentives. This includes the ERAF program, that Emergency Relief Assistance Fund that increases cost shares for municipalities who are taking the necessary steps to improve their infrastructure. We also created a Flood Resilient Communities Fund using some of the ARPA dollars that came to the state in 2021. And that Flood Resilient Communities Fund is used to fill gaps that exist in FEMA programs where we know there's hazard mitigation needed, but it is ineligible for FEMA funding. We've also worked hard to align our climate action plan with both the state hazard mitigation plan and the comprehensive energy plan to make sure that all of these documents speak to each other and that in effect we have climate in all policies. We have emphasized mitigation, restoration, and conservation. Frankly, that's my background in coming into this role. A lot of this work was started because of its clean water benefits, including purchasing river corridor easements, looking to restore functioning floodplains, and those wetland restoration projects I spoke to earlier. The image on the right-hand side of the screen here is actually looking at the changes in one of our river systems over time. We have maps like this from across the state, and that sort of gold bar around the outside shows the anticipated area that the river is likely to move within, and we work with communities to put in place land use planning and regulation that prevents new development in that gold area, thereby avoiding future conflicts. The town road and bridge standards I spoke to previously I see as an important tool. We've created a stream alteration general permit, again, building that collaborative relationship between the state and our local road foremen in terms of how they approach managing our waterways. And we did develop a river corridor model bylaw. It was ultimately adopted by about a quarter of Vermont towns. And in a second, I'm going to talk about what the next evolution of that is likely to be. And then finally, work being led out of our Climate Action Office, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Jane Lazarchak, who's the head of our Climate Action Office. They've been working over the last 12 to 18 months to both develop a municipal vulnerability index so that communities can help screen and understand where their greatest vulnerabilities lie, and then a municipal climate toolkit intended to support implementation of projects to address those key vulnerabilities. In terms of our next steps, we are seeking to maximize FEMA flooding. There was about $600 million worth of damage in Vermont as a result of the July storms this summer. So we are anticipating, in addition to public assistance programs, $75 million in hazard mitigation funding, and want to make sure that we have the $25 million to fully match those dollars and make sure we're funding the best projects, not the best projects that are able to find that necessary cost share in order to reduce future flood damage. We are also starting the work necessary to establish statewide floodplain standards. 274 municipal entities, 274 different approaches. Means it's been really hard for us to provide direct technical assistance or even kind of mutual aid support to towns around Vermont because everyone is different, and we're going to try to rectify that. We are, the governor announced earlier today he's going to provide some initial capital, or is proposing to provide some initial capital in his FY25 budget for an unsafe dam revolving fund. We have a lot of dams that are privately owned. I'm sure that is true here as well. As the old saying goes, you can't get blood from a stone. We have a lot of property owners, dam owners, that simply can't afford to invest in their dams. And so creating a low-cost opportunity to make those investments, we hope, will be something people will take us up on. And then finally, Governor Scott and our state treasurer announced a few weeks ago that they are teaming up to develop a resilience implementation strategy. It's really going to work to pull together many of the existing efforts I've just spoken to, identify remaining gaps where they exist, but really then seek to prioritize how we're going to invest in addressing those needs. And in particular, we'll be leaning on the treasurer for help in forming a long-term funding strategy, sort of looking at the FEMA hazard mitigation money as a bridge that will allow us to do important work over the next couple of years while we build this longer-term plan for resilience. I'll stop there.
Before Julie sits down, we're kind of a small crowd here right now. We can do some questions for Julie, for Secretary Moore, on this presentation and what happened in Vermont. Does anybody have a quick question for her about? Yeah, Joyce, hang on one second. Let me get you mine.
I can't help myself. I grew up in Richmond, and my family lives in Waterbury, and I certainly remember the storm. And I'm just curious, because one of the questions we've talked about, you guys have had significant storms. Are people beginning to retreat on their own? Are you finding people in Montpelier, for example, have been flooded over and over again, or like, you know, to Dr. Vaugh's point of view, they've just had it? Are they leaving, or are they just sticking with it?
I think there's a little bit of it remains to be seen. We had a pretty long gap between flood events here with Tropical Storm Irene and then the really significant July floods. And honestly, what we saw was sort of, a friend and colleague refers to it as flood amnesia, right? People had lost enormous amounts of inventory in the basement of downtown businesses, as you might see in that image. Homeowners had damage to their heating and electrical systems, and slowly over the years, they moved things back into those perilous spaces. And saw really significant damage again this July. I mean, to me, that recognizing people need space, that's the beauty of what we did in Waterbury. We filled in the basement. There isn't a choice there. There's no ability to slip back into bad old habits and take advantage of this unused corner. And I think those are the kinds of strategies we're going to need to take more seriously going forward. We did have flooding again in December, very much to the point Dr. Vaughn raised. I think there was a lot of post-traumatic stress, frankly, in Vermont as we watched floodwaters creep back up into some of our streets. It was not nearly as significant as it was in July, and at the same time, people with wet basements were relatively okay because they hadn't put anything back in their basements.
Other questions about Vermont and what we can learn here in Maine? Yeah, there's a mic right behind you.
Awesome. Hi, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the marginal farmland conservation in floodplain areas and your use of what kind of funding has worked best. My understanding is that you might be using the Clean Water Revolving Fund for part of that, or have historically.
We haven't really. We have a clean water fund in Vermont. Actually, 6% of the state's rooms and meals tax goes into a dedicated fund for clean water right now, which has been an enormous boon to that work. We also receive funding through EPA through one of the geographic area programs that's focused on the Lake Champlain Basin that supports that work. But frankly, part of the reason that particular body of effort is being run out of our Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is part of the Agency of Natural Resources, is they also have ability to access duck stamp funding and other habitat-related funds. And so we really are pulling all of these pieces together. I think going forward, there's some real questions about how we prioritize those projects. Right now, they're being prioritized almost exclusively on their water quality benefits in terms of reducing sediment and nutrient pollution, but we may need to rethink our criteria to give better weight towards resilience. Clean Water SRF is something we've looked at. We have created something we call the WHISPER program, where essentially the agency reduces our administrative fee on state revolving fund loans and returns that to the borrowing municipality to build a natural resources project. So it's sort of fix your wastewater plant, get some sort of restoration project for free. We've had a couple of takers on that, and it works well where communities are planning big wastewater, generally investments anyways, but we haven't yet kind of moved beyond working in those municipalities that were seeking SRF loans.
Okay, great. Anything else? Okay. Thank you, Julie. Fantastic. Okay. Susie. All right, so we got one more presentation, and then we'll start talking amongst ourselves. Susie's back up to talk about all things science and weather. Climate, better said.
Climate. Thank you. So before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the other folks that have helped to inform this presentation. Many of you are in the room: Ivan Fernandez, Steve Dixon, Jess Riley-Moman, Hannah Baranas, Pete Slavinsky, Sean Burkle, Pam Lombard, Jeremy Bell, Kate Dempsey, my colleagues at the Island Institute, and probably some others that I'm missing, so I apologize for that. The governor's question around storm trends was a good one. So as I mentioned, sea level rise trends are fairly straightforward in terms of we know the rate is accelerating and sea level rise is going up. Storm trends are a little bit trickier. As you can see here, these are data from our state climatologist, Sean Burkle. Some of these figures are very recent. Some of the data is from our last scientific assessment. But essentially, when trying to figure out trends in storms here in the Northeast, we know that the climate is getting wetter, the annual mean, and across all seasons. We have heavy precipitation events are becoming more common. A study of the mid-autumn storms in New England found a significant trend towards more precipitation accompanying these high wind storms with gusts over 58 miles per hour. But I think it's just important to mention that the study over that 40-year time period didn't find any significant trend in storm frequency or wind intensity for that period. So a clear need for the SDS going forward, and scientists in Maine working on storm tracking and trends as more investigations needed to understand both historical and projected storm trends in Maine, particularly around that exact question that she asked, around the seemingly increasing frequency and intensity of those storms coming from the southeast. Oh, I get to do that. Okay, got it. Okay, so I'm going to spend the next about 7 minutes talking about some key points of vulnerability in the face of these increasing storms and some actions and tools to improve resilience. So I'm going to hit on 4 key points. This is kind of a hard place to stand here. Can't read that, can't see that. So the key points of vulnerability that I'm going to hit on are accessibility. So I'm going to hit on 4. One is accessibility. People are being cut off during these flood events, and I'm going to try to focus as well on some actions. So I'm going to provide we can provide more guidance on calculating future water levels and develop emergency flood protocols for before, during, and after events. Okay, the second key vulnerability that I think we should focus on is infrastructure. And here the actions are a bit more complicated. We simply need to re-envision our working waterfronts. So this is difficult. We need to develop engineering capacity and regulatory permitting to respond. So essentially, there are 4 choices. We can avoid, we don't build new structures in hazardous areas. We can adapt, so adapting infrastructure to make it more resilient. We can protect through hard infrastructure or natural solutions, or we can relocate. Where it makes sense, relocate that at-risk infrastructure. So the third key point is our natural systems. So those are marshes, beaches, dunes, bluffs, mudflats, eelgrass beds, and more. Several actions obviously needed here, but one is completing erosion hazard modeling and studies that account for future conditions for different shoreline types. And lastly, as mentioned by several people, including Dr. Va, one key vulnerability is mental health. So this can be from direct exposure to climate hazards, can also be from emotional reaction to current and future threats. There are many actions here. They include increased funding for mental health research, prevention and care, increasing access to mental health services, and promoting community-level mental health initiatives. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first key vulnerability that I mentioned, which is accessibility. So this infographic comes from Island Institute's 2019 Waypoints publication and summarizes data from a Nature Conservancy tool that highlights Maine's vulnerability to sea level rise from an accessibility perspective. It shows the percent of road miles inaccessible to emergency services at 2 feet of sea level rise. So the darker the color here, the more inaccessible the town is during a flooding event. 2 feet of sea level rise could also be used as a proxy for storm surge. So it does a pretty good job of showing current risk during flood events. So in the next slide, I'm going to zoom in on Georgetown and Arousik, which are highlighted here. I'm not sure if you can read those, but you'll notice that I'm picking on the region around Bath. I'm from the city of Bath, so I'm picking on my own neighborhood because that's where my lived experience is. Okay, so this Nature Conservancy tool allows you to zoom in on an area with up to 6 feet of sea level rise and see where the roads are inundated and the addresses that are cut off from emergency services. So for your reference, no, that's not it. Up here is this is basically Route 1, the bridge over the Kennebec. This would be the route down, getting onto the island of Arousik. And then right here, this tiny little section of road here is the marsh on Route 127. And with 2 feet, you can see I've clicked 2 feet of sea level rise. It cuts off not only all of Arousik, but the 932 addresses in Georgetown. So this is key information to know when you're planning your commute, when you're busing students around during a flooding event, and particularly, obviously, when there's an emergency. So this inaccessibility threat impacts many more people than just those whose property is getting wet. Okay, so the next key vulnerability that I'll talk really briefly about and share with you one of the tools that is already in existence, so that's what this is about, trying to build off of what tools we already have, is that before kind of re-envisioning our waterfront, it's important to understand the risk. So we should support the education around reading FEMA flood maps. This figure shows Maine's flood hazard map tool, allowing you to zoom in anywhere in the state to see the various flood zones. So this zone AE in Bath shows flooding during a 100-year storm, and it was pretty accurate based on the photos I took on January 13th. Just for perspective, so I was standing about right here, Kate Dempsey and I, taking a note of the flooding happening downtown. That's right about there on that flood map. And then this picture here is in the parking lot. I was standing right about there. So Pete Slavinsky talks about the need for kind of mapping up existing flood maps with flooding that we're actually seeing in current day. So I was pretty pleased to see that the flood map is fairly accurate. Okay, so education around determining elevations of properties is also hugely important, as well as just people being able to interpret a National Weather Service flood forecast. So we don't want to see future infrastructure like EV charging stations going in a flood zone. So moving on to natural systems. These storms were highly impactful to beaches and dunes. After the 2007 Patriots Day storm, for example, beaches took 2 years to recover. So according to past work in our Maine state geologist, who's here in the room, Steve Dixon, his observations thus far, thinking that beaches will be narrow next summer and possibly the following summer. The close timing of the two storms didn't allow the sand to be replenished and protect the dunes. So it's critically important to continue to monitor and map these natural systems and others like bluff stability and marsh migration to inform management and regulations. Okay, so the final key area of vulnerability that I'll hit on is mental health. A recent survey of Maine physicians revealed that many believe that climate change is worsening mental health and well-being among their patients. Given the recent impacts on working waterfront infrastructure, I chose to highlight a program spearheaded by Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. Executive Director Ben Martens is here. He can tell us more about it. Essentially, it's geared toward the mental health of fishermen, but obviously other populations there are other populations that are at risk from climate anxiety and mental health concerns that are exacerbated. Those have been already identified as children and adolescents and indigenous peoples. So what I think I'll end with is something that I've learned, as many of you know. I'm kind of a hope science junkie, thank you. And so something I learned last week from my research into the foray into the science of hope that I think is relevant to today's meeting is this. Imagination is the instrument of hope. We need to help people cast a vision of what future success will look like. Having a visual map that is accessible for reference is a key strategy for nurturing hope in the face of adversity. That is what I hope we can do with the next iteration of Maine Won't Wait.
I love that. Questions for Susie? Any quick thoughts or questions, or Ben Martens, you want to say something more about that last wellness piece? Any questions? Melanie? Yeah.
Thanks, David. Susie, you touched on it briefly. Can you just talk a little bit more briefly about the importance of sand dunes for coastal resiliency?
I can try. I feel like Steve Dixon is right there. So he's the Maine state geologist who studies and monitors our beaches and dune systems. So why don't we just ask him?
Thank you. The dune systems are different from most other shorelines. The sand in the dune ridge is connected to and behaves and moves about with the wave action and the erosion. So the beach and the dune are a coupled system. To put it really simply, think of it like the dune is a savings account and the beach is a checking account. They're coupled, and the sand moves back and forth between the two. So over time, we have to have that interaction of the two together. If we put seawalls in the way, that cuts off that interaction. That's like isolating your checking account from your savings account. and your resiliency goes down in budgetary sense and as an environmental sense. So what happens immediately during a storm is the dune gives up some of its sand. It erodes. We've seen the scarps, we've seen the erosion, the beach lowers. But faster than anybody else could do it, there's a sandbar forming offshore, and that's a speed bump for the surf during that storm and subsequent storms in the winter. And it trips up the waves coming in, so the surf breaks farther offshore, the dunes are less damaged, and it's nature's way of being resilient. So that's kind of how it all rolls out in a short-term sense. And then when the storm season's over in March, April, the sand starts to come back up the beach and restores the beach, creates more beach blanket space, and so on. So it's a natural way of ebb and flow that responds to the storms really better than anything else we could design ourselves. So it's very helpful.
Nice question.
Steve, could I just ask a follow-up to that? And could you just talk about the impacts when there isn't an intact dune system? And a lot of our coastal communities have a lot of houses right on them and don't have that same natural protection.
So you're talking about a situation where there isn't a big dune ridge to give up the sand, right? So your savings account is small, right? And in that case, or if you've got a seawall that's prohibiting it, or there's a road, something like that's in the way, then the beach will still erode. In fact, it'll probably erode faster because it doesn't have the sand supply to keep it at an elevation. So the sand goes down faster on the seaward sense. Now, every tide cycle, the water comes in closer and closer to shore. So the intertidal zone shrinks, wave action comes in with higher forces and hammers whatever's up above that, Route 1A in York or somewhere else. So there's less there. There's less physical infrastructure and protection, and there's less habitat too.
Great. Other questions? Could you grab this mic right here in the middle? And if folks can introduce themselves. Oh, let me go to Ben, and then I'll grab you. Sorry, just from a mic standpoint. Apologies. If folks can introduce themselves.
Ben Martens with the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association. And just two quick comments on Susie's point about mental health and wellness. So one is, like, right now fishermen are in a quick response mode. They're doing things, they're being active, they're cleaning, they're building. And so we are going to start to see the mental health issues start to decline once the action slows. And this is an event where people have lost things that have been parts of their families for generations, right? Docks, piers, wharfs have washed away, been wiped clean, that their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers built, and they lived on and they grew up on. And so there is going to be a very significant loss, personally, that goes along with the infrastructure that many of us might not be able to connect to just because of the generational aspect of a lot of our communities here. And then the second piece is, and this is something that we might be able to address through this process, but we don't have the support. So the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association has been raising money, providing access to counselors for fishermen who might want that, and also educating those of us on the front lines with how to deal with those who might be struggling. But we don't have enough mental health professionals in our state to respond to those of us in the room who might raise their hand and say, I need help, let alone fishermen who are like, I don't have time to go sit in an office and wait. I need to pick up a phone, I need an emergency meeting. So it's a real struggle right now to get access to the people that we need to support the rest of our communities, mental health, physical health, et cetera. And that might be a place that collectively we could identify to invest in, is those types of people and resources.
Thanks, Ben. Ben, can you pass that mic right to the middle here? Carla, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you. Carla Gunther. I'm on the Coastal Marine Working Group, and as Chief Scientist for Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. So I just wanted to say we're located in Stonington, and with the January 10th storm, what I'm wondering about other communities as they were affected, how much did the power grid and losing of trees across roads also exacerbate the accessibility? So like we were cut off at one point on Deer Isle, every road on the island had a tree down or a power line, so the tree couldn't be cut up and removed very quickly down on the road. So I'm wondering about some of our modeling and accessibility. It wasn't just about where the water was. It was like we couldn't have had an ambulance get to anybody, let alone shutting off the bridge and the causeway that happened too. But there's a whole bunch of layers that I'm wondering we can start incorporating into our modeling to understand that accessibility piece.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't have a response other than, yes, we have these map viewers to show us inaccessibility due to flooding. I don't believe we have them for inaccessibility due to downed trees, et cetera, although maybe we do and I'm not aware of it.
Thanks. Could you grab that mic? Any other questions for Susie? And then we're just going to pivot right into having a conversation amongst ourselves. Anything else for Susie? Thanks, Susie. All right. All right. So the last little bit of our conversation here, and I just want to be conscious of time. We do have time, which is great. We got a half hour. And what I'd love to do is, particularly among members of the Climate Council, I want to have a conversation about what we really need to be focusing on in the coming months, given everything that we've been hearing today. We have working groups that are working on this stuff, right? And we can have a conversation amongst ourselves and with some of the co-chairs who are here to say, we need to lean into these kinds of issues. And I want to make sure we're naming them clearly. Like, what are these issues we want to be leaning into? There's an updated climate action plan that's happening. It's underway right now. You all as climate counselors on the Maine Climate Council in June are going to receive a bunch of stuff from the working groups. And then in September, October, you're going to be going into the thick of it, trying to agree on the content of it. So now's a great time to say, this is what we need to work on. Let's not like ask the moon, like we can't ask for everything of our working groups, but we can ask for some stuff. All right, we have co-chairs of the Community Resilience Working Group here, right? Dan Burgess is here from the Energy Working Group. Joyce is here and Jeff Crawford here from Transportation. So we have folks here who can help us say, this is what we're working on now, what else, all right? I'm going to open it up right now, and I'll call on some of those co-chairs as we go, but I'm going to open it up right now to all climate counselors to say, based on everything you just heard, what do we absolutely need to, we, the plural we, be focusing on in the next few months so that we have a great update to this climate action plan? So think about that for a second. What do we really need? Go right ahead. Yes, please.
I think...
and don't forget to introduce yourself.
Noel Bonham, I'm a member of the Climate Council. I think it's very clear from what we've experienced in the last month and a half that we cannot prepare for these kinds of disasters going by trends, because everything is so off trend right now. And how can we actually prepare and factor those anomalies and factor those extreme deviations from what we know is the trend, right? I think there's that thing that I really would like for us to lean into further. Yeah. And also, the other thing, and this probably is a bit of a question to Secretary Moore too, is how are you going to get, very diverse communities from across the state to agree to something that would make a difference, a standardized plan or a standardized commitment to addressing this when we know we're very diverse across the state? There's one thing that, is common to all of us is that we take pride in being independent, right? So how do we then actually kind of have folks understand and come together to respond quickly so we're not waiting for too long to kind of have that be a tremendous adverse impact on our mental health and our well-being as a community across the state?
I love those 2 points. There's a colleague of mine who's online right now, or GoPIFs, who's taking notes as we go, and we're going to show those notes before we finish up to make sure we're capturing everything. Normally I'd have a little flip chart, be working away, but I'm not doing that. I'm wondering, you put a question on the table as well, in addition to those 2 points, Noel, to Julie about 274 communities, right? And yet, you're making progress on that. Do you want to say a word about that quickly, sort of the challenge of 274 communities? Up is on.
I think part of it, okay, is we're seizing the moment, right? Like there is a moment right here where we had widespread flooding that affected well over half of Vermont's communities, and they wished they had more help available to them in the moment. And so we have been trying to work and galvanize that energy and interest into saying one of the ways we can help you more is if everybody has a consistent set of standards and approaches. And it really will, I think, allow us to overcome some of the kind of institutional inertia that keeps folks comfortable with what they have. But I'm also really aware that this is short-lived, and if we don't act now, we may lose that moment. We certainly have had floods and natural disasters sort of in small pockets of Vermont, but because of the statewide footprint of this particular event, I think we have kind of a unique opportunity that really hasn't presented itself since Irene.
Note to Maine, right. Okay, other thoughts?
Hi, I am Chris Kessler. I'm one of the legislative folks on the council. I'm also an auditor and home inspector. And I think one of the important things from my vantage point is around home repair. And it hits a lot of different aspects of the crisis that we're facing right now. For one, in a home's basement, you have people who are experiencing these floods and these events, but also a wet basement is something that prevents a home from being, air sealed, and to add new heating systems or insulation. It also impacts the indoor air quality of the home. And also, a lot of these homes are not insured when the events happen. So a focus on home repair is going to check a lot of boxes, particularly with the wet basements, I think. So.
Okay. All right. So, Lucy Online, I hope you're taking notes of this stuff, and we will be showing it back. Here we go.
I'm Bob Baines. I represent the fishing industry. This isn't really not for the working groups, but for our state commissioners, our delegation people. The fishing industry needs infrastructure and access, obviously, and it's been talked about. Kathleen talked about it in Stonington. Meredith did as well. Guys are going to start building back real soon. We need to build back. Permitting, how do we get around it? How do we cut the red tape? Funding, where's the money going to come from to build back better and stronger and taller? It's a huge short-term problem to get us back up and running. Some harbors made out all right, some are devastated. The state, the delegation, the feds, whatever help can be provided to get our fishing communities back up and running in the near term. And then, for the working groups, what do we do in the long term?
Let's go right behind you, yeah. I promise I'll move away from this particular cluster.
Thank you. Gary Lamb, I'm on the council representing MMA's 300-plus towns in the state. And I guess maybe we could challenge our civil engineering community to figure out a better way to attach a pier to the earth without it being able to be lifted from below, pull out modular holes so the wave action can come up through. I don't know, just let Habib and company add it. So first of all, better attachment, but a different structure up above so that it won't be lifted off like the pictures we saw today.
There should be engineering solutions to some of this, yeah. Okay, so again, thinking about what we want to ask of our working groups, and I see we got our folks online too, and so I would invite, some of our counselors who are online, if you have any questions, just raise your hand or make yourself known and feel free to jump into the conversation. We can see your faces in the room now. So, all right, just let us know, folks online, if there's anything you want to say. What else do we need to make sure we're talking about over the coming months and we have a conversation about in June? Hannah?
I'll let Melanie hit on this as well, but I think David started to talk about, we've given the working groups a lot of charges. You all have tall tasks. We're trying to build in equity. We're trying to ensure we get to every part of the state. But I think part of this resilience conversation, even though we've invited the Resilience Working Group and Coastal and Marine, I think, Representative Kessler started to talk about it. I think we actually see resilience as part of the work of every working group. I mean, clearly our transportation systems need to be resilient. I think Susie used the example, yes, when we're building new EV charging, I think Joyce is going to make sure it's not in the floodplain. But our buildings, obviously, there's a lot we can build into it, and I think Dan started to talk about energy storage. How do we build more resilience in homes, especially those people who are most vulnerable? When Melanie's down there with a tipped over oil barrel, obviously we can help that homeowner repair in a way, and I think Vermont has actually done this. Our energy systems, I think Dan already touched this, but clearly our natural working lands, our farmers, our loggers, they're facing many of the similar impacts, and how do we build resilience into our climate plan in a really, I think, across-the-board way? I mean, that is our charge, and we absolutely get it. Clearly, there are lots of good ideas that have come about when it comes back about thinking about infrastructure, but I really think this resilience theme is something that is no one of us, every single working group, I think, has already touched on it in the last climate plan, but it's now our charge to go a lot deeper. So I'm going to pass it off to Melanie because I think she's thinking along the same lines.
Thanks, Hannah. Well, I guess I would ask of the council, amongst all of the working groups, to think about difficult choices. And that we're faced with a situation where we've talked about rebuilding. People have to make decisions about whether or not to invest in properties where they could experience damage in the future. How do they afford to build in ways that are going to make them resilient when that storm hits again? And where maybe should people not be continuing to make investments? Maybe it's not about rebuilding, but like in Vermont, where they showed zones where you're not encouraging new development. So assume that we're going to see these impacts in some areas, and how do we help communities make those kind of choices? I mean, every one of our communities is independent. They all have their own identity, those things that are important to them and to their local economies. So as a council and as working groups, how do we give communities, how do we give state government the guidance to make those choices for Maine's people?
So one of the things I want to do is we have a community resilience working group, right? And Judy East is here, who's one of the co-chairs. And Judy, I wanted to give you the mic for a second, because as Hannah has said, and Melanie is saying, it's really our responsibility, like the energy working group's going to have to figure this out and have some thoughts, transportation, buildings. Could you say just a word what you all are working on right now in your working group, so folks get a sense of where you're putting your attention and where maybe you're not putting your attention? Here comes a mic, Judy. And you can, wherever you want to be, you can come up here, stay there, wherever you want to be.
If it's okay, I'll stay here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So thank you, David and Hannah and Melanie, because as this conversation has unfolded, the magnitude of the resilience responses has been overwhelming. And the fact that every working group is going to work on this is a huge relief because we've just started our conversation. We had a meeting on Friday, and we used the chat as a way of bearing witness, if you will, in the way that we did today. And people described just what happened to them all. And then we had a facilitated conversation around so what worked and what didn't work, both in terms of preparation and response, and heard some really good input. And one of the sort of high-level consensus points that came out multiple times was the importance of communication, when it worked and how it helped, and the need to improve it. So that's one of the big things that has risen for us in terms of a theme. We also anticipated before all of these disasters that we would have to have the difficult conversations around getting out of harm's way. That's the way it's what I use the term. And that those are incredibly difficult conversations, and to have heard it so many times this afternoon is encouraging, because it's kind of scary to put a tough conversation out there sometimes. We also expect to discuss the whole issue of the human toll, the mental health toll, psychological resilience, if you will. And I've heard that many times today, so that's part of what we anticipate discussing. And then what was really wonderful, and I was just chuckling with Sam because he brought this forward for our group. Unfortunately, we're losing Sam. Sam's going to USGS, but so he's still part of the team. And we have Annie back. Thank you, Annie, for jumping back in. But Sam articulated that what our group needs to do is marry the conversation of those people who are doing resilience planning better with those who are doing emergency management, both planning for and response. And I heard in Julie's remarks from Vermont that you're doing that, and that was so powerful. And so it's nice to know we're on the same page there. We may be a little bit behind you, though the state hazard mitigation plan was just released. Well done, Sam, right before you leave. So let's see, what else did I want to, oh, and I guess the other thing that we also reiterated several times in our meeting was we often talk about coastal, and I was channeling you, Joyce. Inland, the 5 disaster declarations in Maine last year, not including the December 18th event, because that hasn't been declared yet. We had 5 in Maine last year. Usually we have maybe 1. And Sam has a great map showing who got hit worst. It's Oxford, Franklin, Somerset. They got hammered 3 and 4 times in those disaster declarations last year, not including December 18th. So this is so much also an inland conversation that we have to have. So that was very much part of our conversation last week. And then I guess it was all around where we tried to get to, and I'm realizing this is an impossible task, is we want to come up with metrics for resilience. And as we dig into that and realize we have 2 meetings to do it, these are going to be pretty high level. Brian Nathan from DEP and I were at a U.S. Climate Alliance webinar yesterday. California is looking at these metrics, Minnesota, Oregon, New York. So the conversation we're having is what other states are having all around the country. So we're also trying to learn from what they're doing. And so it's a work in progress. But I'm really glad that all of you are going to be thinking about this too. And it's not just falling on our working group.
Thanks, Judy. So, and just to be clear then, so your request to the buildings working group is think about buildings resilience. Are you thinking that the buildings working group also should be thinking with you around the getting out of harm's way and siting and those kinds of conversations? I'm just curious sort of how you see the expertise on your group and where you would like expertise from other groups.
Well, great question. I talked to Nick Battisto. There was a meeting with the Maine Islands Coalition today with legislators just before this meeting. And he's wanting the Coastal and Marine Working Group to gather with ours on the question of, okay, build back, how, where, and it isn't necessarily in exactly the same place or in exactly the same way. So, you know, to the extent that we can articulate what we're trying to do and ask that the other working groups think along the same lines, but from their perspective, sure, I think we should share that. I think we've already tried to do that. Everyone's kind of seen what everybody else is doing. And it feels to me that this iteration of the climate plan is so much more about those interconnections and cross conversations across working groups than last time. We knew it was last time, but we had so much to do already. Yeah. So yes, we'll be in touch.
Yeah, and I think it's something for Hannah's team and my team as well from a facilitation standpoint to make sure we have those cross conversations happening where they need to happen. Yeah. So we'll be working together with you and others on that in the coming weeks to make sure we're doing that as seamlessly as possible.
Kathleen?
And I think just to that point, we've talked about it a little bit. I mean, Melanie has just launched some work around waste, which is a very intersectional issue that we're trying to manage in this climate plan. But I also say land use issues. And land use certainly intersects with many of the resilience conversations, but it also impacts some of our vehicle miles traveled and transportation emissions. It impacts how we think about buildings and density. So I would say land use is something that the Climate Council is going to tackle in a very cross-sectional way, and stay tuned for that coming to many of your working groups meetings soon.
Yeah. Let's take another hand or two, and then we're getting to the end of the road here. Oh, you got a mic, even better.
I do.
Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself,
Is it okay for a
Kathleen.
working group member to ask a question?
Absolutely. Just
Okay,
introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Kathleen Layden. I work for the Department of Marine Resources in the Coastal Zone Management Program. And I have a really hard question because we've heard from the coastal fisheries, and we didn't hear so much about tourism. We did a little bit in Western Maine, but that's on a schedule too to get back up and running. With this urgency on the part of people who own land and need to make those changes, how is that timing going to work out so we don't miss? We have to live with the coast of Maine and live with the mountains in Maine, so we have choices about people and the environment. How's that timing going to work out? And I'm sorry I asked that question. I'm looking at you, Hannah.
I'd share this question with Melanie. I mean, I think that our work as a Climate Council, we're dealing with a very immediate event. And luckily, Pete Rogers and Ann Fuchs and their team and lots of others in state government are responding to an immediate emergency. We are trying to rapidly learn because we are trying to make a long-term climate plan for the state of Maine. We're updating a plan. We have some things underway that we should all be proud of, but clearly we have a lot more to do. So I think to answer your question, I mean, I think the immediate disaster response and rebuilding is frankly, we need to learn from it as a Climate Council. We will all be advocating, in our other jobs, but our job is to put forward a climate plan that continues to move Maine in the right direction. I think Melanie spoke to a bill before the legislature right now on permitting issues that will speak to Bob's point about rebuilding back. I mean, we haven't even gotten into contractors and workforce. Clearly, funding is a huge question, understanding federal resources. I think the immediacy of challenges we're going to see this summer are going to be before us all, but the Climate Council really needs to keep its eye on the long term. That is our job. I think we're learning from these urgent events. We're all going to play a part in how to respond to them, but our job is to put forward a plan by December 1 of this year that really starts to incorporate all this knowledge into better policies, community-level actions, state funding decisions for the long term. And Melanie may be able to speak more to that point as well.
Great. All right, so we're almost at the half past. Melanie, do you want to say anything? Sorry. Sorry.
I mean, you can keep going, David, if you want to. So I'm sure that folks would like to know about permitting, right? So, well, just take the elephant in the room as it pertains to DEP and emergency response. People want to be able to do things now, and we can't get permits out the door fast enough. We're not the only permitting agency in some cases. I can't speak for Army Corps. I won't take any responsibility for them. For our part, we are trying to identify those areas where, first, are there changes we can do through an emergency enactor on LD 2030 that are the kind of changes that are going to make sense, right? But then we're listening to lessons like what we hear from Vermont, where they had communities that were doing in-stream removal of debris and removing sediment, and found out after the fact, looking at it later, that maybe more was done than should have been done, right? And so we're trying to figure out where's that right balance of letting some things go right now and saying, if you've got to get back to work, you've got to rebuild that thing to be able to, go back to making money, to get the boats out on the water. Do your damnedest to follow the rules, other than you have to have a permit before you do it. And please get it right so that if we have to give you a permit after the fact, we don't have to ask you to spend more money to modify it to meet the standards that we didn't have the chance to talk to you about ahead of time. right? We do not have enough people to get out there in every community issuing permits on the spot. Our standards are rigorous for a reason, right? So the other side of what happens with DEP permitting is you might want to rebuild that thing. Your neighbor is not going to like it when it is 4 feet higher. They are going to call my people and complain that now your pier is too big and it's ruining their view, or that maybe it's 2 inches wider than it was before. And how could we possibly have let that happen? And so we're trying to figure out how to facilitate this as much as we possibly can for everybody, using all of the lessons we're learning to try to do it better and be more prepared for next time, and just to get through this as best we can and the smartest way we can without giving up on all the environmental protections that everybody thought were important up until all these storms hit.
Tricky little balance there. Tricky little balance. Lucy, I'm going to call on you in just a second to share your notes if you're in a place to do that. Ben had one more comment. Yeah.
Yeah, just one of the things that Kathleen brought up early on in the presentation was around gentrification. And right now, the coast of Maine is under unprecedented pressure to turn over and be bought and transitioned away from not just working waterfront, but current residents, right? People who are living in places like Harpswell and Port Clyde, Georgetown, are being slowly pushed inland because of the cost of housing. And this type of an event, I really worry, is one of those watershed moments where you suddenly see a massive number of people who are like, well, I no longer have this infrastructure. I no longer have these things. It's going to take too much money to put into this. Now I'm going to sell. And that type of an event can transition an entire community really quickly when it comes to who's sitting on committees, who's making decisions about easements, ordinances, et cetera. And so I think that that's an important part of equity within the Climate Council, and I know that there's a lot of other important parts of equity that we talk about, but those that are disadvantaged when it comes to their ability to participate, those that have financial disadvantages, it's, you know, that's really, really hard in this equation, and I recognize that, but this is the type of event that I think is scary when it comes to an equity conversation around those who have been living here for a long time, and the money, the scale of the money that can come in to these places. So.
Thanks, Ben. Okay. All right, folks. So I'd asked a colleague, Lucy, if she could take some notes, and I wonder, Lucy, if you're there to be able to share your screen. Let's just see if we're capturing what we need from this. And sorry to put you on the spot right now, but if you're able to share your screen with those notes, that would be fantastic. We got Lucy, but we don't got the notes. Here we go. Okay. So there it is. Let's just take I'm not going to read this. That'll be terrible. But just take a look at these for 1 second. Yeah.
David, in the room, are you seeing a full slide, or are you seeing presentation view?
We're seeing presentation view, but it's not terrible. We can see it.
Okay, it's quite small anyway.
Yeah. It looks good, right? Yeah. Thank you, Lucy. I think that is a very good summary, and we'll send that around, and if you don't see a key point that we talked about today, please let us know, and we'll make sure we capture that. We want to share this with all the working groups. We want folks to be able to know that you all had a conversation, and you have some things you really want to work on. There you go. That's even better. Right. Nice. Okay, now we can really see it. Let's leave it up for a second more. I'll get out of the foot. People want to take photos and stuff. I don't want to. All right. Okay. All right, folks. That brings us to the end of our meeting. I will ask Hannah or Melanie if you have anything else you want to say before we finish up, besides the fact that there still are plenty of cookies left over here, so don't leave without taking one of those. Hannah, can I turn? Yeah? Yeah, thank you for saying that, Kathleen. We do have some climate counselors on the screen, and so I don't know if any of you were eager to jump in and say a word, but let me just make sure that you know you're able to if there's something that you've been meaning to say. For those of you who are joining us online, climate counselors. I think that was no. Ken, do you have something you want to say?
Hi, David. Thank you. Yes, and thank you for the opportunity. Just a thought, and Ivan or Susie would be much better able to comment on this than I, but it occurs to me that I hope we don't, as a climate council, respond to the events of the last month. Mother Nature has basically sent us a message, and that message isn't to prepare for more storms like this. It's to prepare for more storms like this and worse. So let's make sure that we raise the bar, not just to this level, but to the next level and perhaps the one after that, to the extent that we can, to protect our citizens and our economy and our state. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. That's good. And I think we heard a comment like that. I think it was Noel who said something along those lines too, of like, let's remember the trend line's not great for this particular problem, right? It's very choppy. All right, Hannah, last words?
I'll give Melanie a last word too, sorry. There's a lot of cookies. To Ken's point, actually, I think it's actually a very good one to keep in mind at the end. What the scientists have told us, and Ivan says it frequently, and he'll say it again in just a couple of months as we hear the STS's major report to our Climate Council. These climate events are already incredibly challenging. They will be made worse if we can't reduce our emissions. That is what the scientists continue to tell us, that storm events will get much, much worse if we can't, as a state, as a country, as a globe, figure out ways to reduce emissions. So I actually think that's a really well taken point, because clearly resilience and preparing for climate changes are urgent, as is our many strategies to reduce emissions. So they are, I think, equally important in all of our minds. That being said, I just want to really thank all the folks who are both on the panel, really thank our Vermont folks, one of whom's having a birthday, and one of whom had a birthday yesterday. And their governor gave a State of the State today, so it just shows how much they care for the state of Maine that they would come here and actually give us this kind of guidance. And I will just say they've been great partners, and we will keep tapping them. Every bullet point we saw up there, we actually need your entire plan, because we need to learn from you. But I just want to, again, thank the Climate Council and working groups, the congressional delegation members and staff who are here today. This clearly will be a partnership, and we have a lot of heavy lifting to do. So our next meeting is in March, and that will be an opportunity to actually hear a much more in-depth report from our science and technical subcommittees. Clearly, all of our working groups are meeting a lot already, and they are working on hearing from Maine citizens, coming up with strategies. So we're grateful for that, but we're especially grateful to all of you who kind of took time out for a meeting that you only heard about at the end of last week. So the fact that you're here and hundreds of people tuned in online, we're just incredibly grateful for that. So with that, I'll pass it to Melanie. But thank you all for coming and staying until it got dark. It's almost dark.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you all also for coming, for spending this time with us today. Congresswoman Pingree, you should be proud of your daughter. She's amazing, and has assembled an incredible team of people who help bring us all together to be able to have these kind of conversations. And of course, our stellar facilitator, who we did lend to Vermont for facilitating their climate council as well. As Hannah mentioned, and I often remind you all, don't forget that we asked you to join the council to do work for us. So we very much look forward to you putting your excellent minds together to come up with great recommendations for the next 4 years. But to steal the governor's phrase, Maine won't wait, and the legislature is in session, and so, meetings like this don't just result in recommendations that go into a plan that we think about in 4 years from now. These kind of conversations are the seeds of actions that are happening every day that we're putting into action with every opportunity that we have. So thank you for taking the time with us today, and in all of the future meetings that you will be sitting through to come up with the next version of our 4-year plan.
Thanks. That's it. We're done. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.